You're like, hey, yeah, that's a great looking watch. I'd be like, bro, flip it around. And you're like, oh shit. What's going on, guys? Wei and Jeremiah Chan here in our Grail Watch office, wearing our Grail Watch hats this time. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you, Wei?
Dude, I'm great, and I'm so excited because I get to present Grail Watch 2. So as you know, Grail Watch was a company that we created to, advance the whole idea of limited edition watches to make them as ambitious as possible.
Right.
So in Grail Watch 1, our chapter was expressing the whole idea of dream collaborations. That was chapter 1 for Grail Watch, and the watch that was the result of that was a collaboration between Renaissance and Alan Silberstein, which expressed a motif of memento mori, or time is passing, and that watch has done very well for us.
I mean, we were inundated with requests.
Yes, incidentally, for those of you who were not happy about that, I know we had a whole conversation, but you can DM us at Grail Watch Official, and we will definitely put you on the list for the next collaboration that we're doing with Alan Silberstein, which will now launch in January. However, let's get to Grail Watch 2, and that is a new chapter. It's chapter 2, and it's about the revival of past icons. So Jeremiah, for me, and I'm sure for you as well, we kind of go through our watch journalistic lives, and we see vintage watches that we just wish brands were revived. They're like, that's such an amazing watch. It would be wonderful if you were to bring this back for the customer of today.
Right.
And so one of the watches that I was, absolutely struck by, and a watch that I was so hopeful that we could remake, was a really interesting chronograph that came from the 1990s and that was made by Franck Muller.
Right, and Franck Muller, I regard him as probably the first rock star in the watch industry, right? He was so, avant-garde first of all, he branded himself as a master of complications, and that was such a bold move on his part, right? To stamp his authority, and stamp his position in the industry. But before that time, when the Centre Curvex case became an icon of the brand, right? He created a watch that was round-shaped, and like you say, a chronograph, and I think not many people know about that one.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, what's really clear is, I think in the 1990s, that the independent watchmakers clearly had a huge affinity for vintage Patek Philippe, right?
Right.
And we see this obviously with Roger Dubuis in the late 90s. He comes out with the H40, or the Homage 40 chronograph, which is a tribute to the Patek Philippe 1463 or Tassi Tondi.
Which I think everyone hopes Patek will bring back, but that's highly unlikely.
So what was really interesting was that, after I was kind of scouring the internet, I came across a watch that was being sold on Collected Man, off Silas Walton's site. And it actually predates the Roger Dubuis H40 by a couple of years. I think it's in the mid-90s. And it's a Franck Muller chronograph that also pays tribute to the 1463, at least clearly does in my mind, because it has a case that's very similar to the original Francois Bourgel case of the 1463. It's got this kind of really cool combination between, a supple, elegant bezel with kind of a muscular case, bearing in mind that the 1463s were the first waterproof gentleman's chronographs.
Screw-down case back.
Exactly, yeah, with the screw-down case back. And then it has these kind of gorgeous, voluptuous, domed pushers, which are then fluted to look like, I think you mentioned to me once, the turbine of an aircraft,
exactly,
right?
Yeah, and it seemed, so forward-thinking of its time.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. So I want to talk to you about this because I know we were discussing this earlier. I think that these watches were, kind of like designed for a different purpose than the Roger Dubuis watches, right?
Right.
The Roger Dubuis watches, when they were released in the late 90s, were only available in precious metal. They were using the Lemania 2310, which was the same movement that Patek was using for its base caliber for the 3970, the 5004, and for the 5070 as well. Now, in the meantime, Franck Muller came out with his watches in the earlier 90s, and they had steel cases. They were water resistant, they were amagnetic, and they used, instead of the 2310, the movement that succeeded the 2310, and was, yes, a more industrial movement, but also a movement that was created to be more reliable and easier to set up 2-counter and 3-counter movements, which we found in the Speedmaster as well.
Right. I mean, comparing Roger Dubuis and Franck Muller, you could say that Roger Dubuis wanted to compete directly with Patek Philippe.
Yes.
Because he created watches only in precious metal, that's one. Secondly, he finished his movements, to Geneva steel standards. But I think Franck wanted to create a watch that was more wearable for the everyday in stainless steel, and obviously we know that Lemania movements are cam operated instead of the column wheel.
Correct.
In the 2310.
But what I love was the design of these watches, right? So the design of the watches came in 2 different versions. A 2-counter version with a silver dial, which we have convinced Franck Muller to do a tribute to us for. and also in a 3-counter version with this stunning black dial as well.
Well, you should tell us, how did you manage to convince Franck Muller to collaborate with us on Grail Watch 2?
So I took these images off of Silas's website. Silas, thank you very much. And I went to Franck Muller and I said, listen, I love these watches so much. I'm obsessed with that style of chronograph, those kind of pushers. Breguet applied numeral dials are like an obsession for me. I was like, do you think we could remake these for today? And they said, you know, we've been thinking about it as well, but we would be forced to use potentially an automatic movement.
No, that's not right.
And it would cause the watch to actually be quite thick, right? And I was like, guys, you know, as much as like I want to be accepting to watches of all shapes and sizes, I have to say that in this particular situation, that watch should be slim. It should be the original dimensions of the watches that were made in the 90s. Is that at all possible? And they said, well, you know, based on the current stock that we have of movements, it's impossible, unfortunately. So then they said, well, wait a second. So then Jean-Luc Glenat, who is the product director of Franck Muller Watchland, and Nicolas Rudez, who is the managing director, they went off. And about 10 minutes later, they came back with their arm full of trays, right? And I was like, what do you guys have in your trays? What is this? They put it in front of me and they showed me original Lemania chronograph movements from the 1990s.
I'm sure your mind was blown.
I was like, dude, I can't believe that. And they were like,
You were just building up, right, to the excitement of wanting to show that
well,
to
I
you.
actually asked them, it's like, do you guys have these like planned all the time?
Yep.
They said, well, we knew we had something, but we had to go get someone to dig them out. And then we had to see whether or not they can still function to the standards that we need them to today.
Sure.
But we're happy to tell you that we have, you know, enough new old stock movements that we can build a couple of series of these watches for you to the original dimensions. So then we decided, okay, we're going to make this watch for today. What are the small things that we change? Okay, so the first thing we decided on is we're going to make the case slightly larger. So now it's 39 mm in diameter, which I think is the perfect sort of like balance point for a modern watch. That is a tribute to the past. The original ones were 37. And on top of that, we decided to make the dial even a little bit more expressive, a little sexier, right? So if you look at the grené or frosted finish in the center of the dial, that pattern has been exaggerated a little bit. If you look at the size of the Breguet numerals, those have actually been enlarged a little bit. The applied dot markers also enlarged a little bit, and everything optimized to show the contrast and finish on those dials even more.
Yeah, but it's so subtle. I mean, I think Jean-Luc was telling you that they only did like very subtle changes, and you can only see the difference if you compare the original with the one that we have now.
Side by side, exactly. So the other thing about this watch as well is, you know, Jean-Luc was like, you know, Wei, the watches were intended to be amagnetic watches. Frank wanted them to be watches that you could wear and use every day, you know, without any concern. But in order for us to make them truly amagnetic, we need to you know, include a solid case back. But it's almost a shame because we want to showcase this sort of incredible new old stock 90s movement that's in there, right? Yeah. And then he's like, so I hope you will agree that maybe we should give every owner 2 case backs and they can choose. They can put the solid case back on to have it, you know, fully amagnetic, and you can even engrave something on the back of your case back, or you could have the sapphire case back, which allows you to see the beauty of that movement.
My pick would be the sapphire.
Mine
you guys can choose.
Mine too.
You guys can choose.
You know, and I have to say, you know, when I got these watches, like I was absolutely blown away by them. The size is perfect, the finishing of the case is perfect, the dial, the detail on the dial is glorious. Right. And then you look at that movement, and it's just so cool to have something like that, you know, like transported to you from a time machine from the 90s directly to your wrist for today.
I love the step bezel.
Dude, the step bezel is so good.
On the dial.
And then check also the pushers, right? So we actually asked them to do fluted pushers because the original watches did not have fluted pushers.
Right.
And we wanted that to be like, for those people who have the modern watch, then you know immediately it's from this limited edition because the original François Bourgel pushers were fluted, right?
It's a little design detail. If you know, you know.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Exactly. So we've got 50 pieces of the black 3-counter watch, which we have here. We've got 50 pieces of the silver 2-counter watch, which we have here, and both of these dials were based on the very original watches that were launched back in the 90s. Then it was super funny because Nicolas said, you know, Frank has heard about this project, he loves it, and he wants to say something to you. So he put me on the phone with Frank, and I'm like, Frank, how are you? I think he was calling me from his house in Thailand. Okay. And he said, Wei, if you're going to relaunch Franck Muller chronographs from the 1990s, you have to do the double-sided chronograph.
Wow.
And I'm like, wait, what are you talking about? Because there is a very famous chronograph from the 1990s, which is a chronograph where the chronograph hand is attached to a pinion that travels all the way through the watch, through the movement, to a second dial that's on the back of the watch, and that second dial has scales, telemeter, tachymeter, and pulsometer.
I'll show it to you guys right here.
And that's the watch that we brought back, right? And this was actually a suggestion from Franck Muller himself. And you know what I love about this watch is it's so incredibly wearable. It's also 39 mm in diameter, which was the original size of this watch. It's got such a cool configuration because it's a black dial with this beautiful sunray guilloche finish to it. It's got 3 sub-dials. The sub-dial on the left is for continuous seconds. The sub-dial on the right is for the minute counter of the chronograph. And the sub-dial at 6 o'clock is for the time, which gives you maximum dial expanse to read the chronograph hands. I say hands because it's not just a normal chronograph, but it's a split-second chronograph, which and the pusher has been integrated into the crown, like the original watches, because Franck said that that's the way he wanted it, because it's the most elegant configuration. So you have basically 3 chronographs in here. You've got a normal chronograph, a split-second chronograph, and then if you flip the watch over, you've got a second chronograph that gives you an expanded scale for everything. And it's such a cool thing at a party to be able to sort of like, or at a watch gathering, where
take it off your wrist and show it off the back, right?
You're like, hey, yeah, that's a great looking watch. I'd be like, bro, flip it around, and you're like, oh shit. And what was so ingenious about Franck, and I think he got this from vintage pocket watches, is that what you do is you have the scales running counterclockwise, right? Because it's at the back of the watch, the hand will be running counterclockwise as well. And you've got this massive hand that reads these scales that allow you such maximum legibility for scales that are normally just on the perimeter of the dial and are so hard to read, you know? And I think that's so absolutely ingenious. He is a great, great man.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, the design of the watch is exactly faithful to the original watch that he created back in the 1990s, and it become something of a darling on the secondary market and actually on the auction market as well. So
something else that I also like, you mentioned earlier, is the time indication of the hour and minute at 6 o'clock. You can see that design code and DNA then translate to other Franck Muller pieces of a later time period, like the Master Banker.
Oh yeah, of course. Yeah, where you've got 2 of them, one on top of the other. 6, exactly. Yeah, no, it's
just preceded that, so
it is really like the equivalent of like getting a Ferrari Testarossa, like transported to you for today, but functioning up to the spec of today as well. So all 3 of these watches are going to be made in limited editions. We're going to do 50 pieces of the Lemania 2-counter watch with a silver dial. We're going to do 50 pieces of the Lemania 3-counter watch with the black dial, but we're going to do just 30 pieces of this incredible double-sided chronograph / split-second chronograph.
Yeah, to celebrate the 30th anniversary of Franck Muller.
To celebrate the 30th anniversary of Franck Muller, which happens this year. And box sets number 1 to 10 will contain all 3 of these watches.
Okay.
So, that's kind of a cool thing as well.
So from watch 11 to 50 for, the chronograph, single-sided chronographs will be individual pieces.
Correct. The individual pieces will be watches 11 to 50 for these 2, and then watches 11 to 30 for the double-sided chronograph. So guys, that's it. Thank you so much for tuning in to the next chapter of Grail Watch. Jeremiah, thank you for joining me.
We're incredibly excited to show this to you guys.
Guys, the last thing I want to say is a huge thank you to all of our friends at Franck Muller for making this dream a reality. For our friends at Franck Muller Watchland, the great Barton Sermakas, Sassoon Sermakas, Nicolas Rudez, and Jean-Luc Lenat. Guys, thank you so much. And for our friends in Franck Muller USA, Hroch and Ron Jackson, you guys are amazing, and you guys really made this a reality, and we have so much appreciation for you. Thank you. And lastly, to Franck Muller himself, Franck Muller Actual.
He's a design genius.
Yes, design genius, master of complications, and just all-around cool guy. I love you, dude. I gotta come find you and have some beers with you in Thailand, and thank you so much for this collaboration. And thank you for the idea of doing the double-sided chronograph. Guys, thank you for tuning in to the launch of Grail Watch 2, and I wish you guys all the best. Cheers.
Yeah, we hope you guys love these watches as much as we do.
That's it.